Resident Evil is the epitome of tonal whiplash. It starts with an incredibly cheesy live-action cutscene that tries but fails to be scary. Then the actual game begins inside the mansion with some ridiculous-ass writing and hilariously horrendous voice acting.
What is this? Wow, what a mansion!
Captain Wesker, where's Chris?
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Even the first zombie reveal can't save the situation. Resident Evil creates an impression of a title that can't be taken seriously at all. And then you get into full control of your character and holy shit, this dude ain't dead! You go through a corridor and holy shit, this freaking dog jumped through the windows and they're so fast! Couple rooms later, you suddenly run out of bullets and the zombies bite you to death. I hope you have saved your progress, an action that's a finite resource of its own. Resident Evil the story and Resident Evil the game are two absolutely different things. Resident Evil the story is funny, and I really doubt that's on purpose. All semblance of dramatic tension disappears the second any character opens their mouth.
What is it?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things.
Foreshadowing that's supposed to instill fear literally does the opposite.
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
Even a cutscene showcasing a new type of enemy appearing as they run with ridiculously fast speeds is made less impactful by those fearsome monsters being polite enough to properly open and close doors. Just because you're a killing machine doesn't mean property damage is okay. And then in Resident Evil the game, those monsters can potentially kill you in one hit. Resident Evil the game is not funny at all. It's tense, it's suspenseful, you hope that you'll have enough bullets and healing items to handle whatever it is you'll find beyond the next door, constantly making strategic choices not only regarding how to spend your resources, but whether you should engage with the enemies in the first place. Those two facets of Resident Evil meet somewhere in the middle within the aspects of lore and puzzles. The game tries to weave a relatively intricate world-building fabric surrounding secret experiments with the pharmaceutical company umbrella going all kinds of wrong, while the mansion acts as a cover for their hidden lab with tons of esoteric protective measures. And by the way, this is actually a pretty smart approach to have things make contextual sense, even if it's something as seemingly unintuitive as grabbing a red jewel from one statue's head and then placing it in another to unlock something. At least that's enough to suspend your disbelief. But that is undone once again by people opening their mouths. And you realize that nobody actually had any idea that playing Moonlight Sonata would open a hidden door.
You like it?
Oh, that was great!
What is that?
So, let me get this straight. In a house full of zombies, a trained Special Forces operative allows a rookie to spend time practicing how to perfectly play Beethoven because it sounds very good, I guess? Resident Evil keeps jumping between funny yet ridiculous dialogues that destroy any semblance of dramatic tension.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
And intense, nerve-pounding gameplay that in the first playthrough has you questioning absolutely every step. Let's focus on the latter aspect first and explore what makes this survival horror actually tick by taking a look at its core pillars. Resident Evil is exceptionally great at setting up everything it is about in the first 10-15 minutes of playtime. In the beginning, you have access only to a knife, which is absolutely useless, so there is no reason to talk about it, and a handgun with not enough bullets to kill more than a few zombies. It should be noted, however, that in the game proper there is enough weapons and ammunition to obliterate absolutely every single enemy in the game. The catch? It's very unevenly spread out, as are the zombies and other kinds of monsters. So while in the game proper you will never get stuck even if you unload absolutely every bullet into thin air, after all it is possible to reach the end with only the shitty knife, though it won't be easy, on your first playthrough you also never know when and where you'll find additional ammo if you decide to use what you have now. This forms the first important pillar of Resident Evil: resource management. It's a very simple question with quite a lot of depth to it. Do you trade ammunition for safety, or do you conserve it for later and try to risk evasion? In Resident Evil, even a single zombie is a pretty dangerous foe, and rooms with 2 or 3 of them can be outright considered difficult. What adds more to the consideration of your resources is the limited inventory space. Ammunition stacks in one slot, so there is potential to carry your entire arsenal and some healing items to boot. But here's the real kicker: you also need inventory space for key items. This is where we get to Resident Evil's second important pillar: puzzles. Now look, Resident Evil is not trying to really challenge your logical thinking. The actual puzzles that you will find all have explicit hints towards their solution and in general are fairly simple. Press buttons in the correct order based on descriptions, do some basic letter correlation or math solving, push statues over some holes, push crates over some holes, push a statue over a hole, push a statue into a hole, push 3 crates to fill a hole. Okay, look, Resident Evil likes its pushing at holes perhaps a bit too much. And yes, pushing can get boring, but Resident Evil is not an adventure game, so the complexity of actual puzzles is not that important. What is important, and why a puzzle pillar exists, is the fact that the environments are a puzzle box themselves. Abstractly speaking, we have a set of keys and their corresponding keyholes spread all over the place. And the puzzle is not realizing which key is required for which hole, even though there are objects you have to examine and check before you can use them, but how do you get every key item to their destination? Puzzles, rudimentary as they are, exist to facilitate resource management. Your inventory space is limited, and yet you have to find efficient pathways back and forth throughout the mansion to bring all items to their correct locations, while figuring out which rooms are better to clear out, which are fine to leave as is, and so on. The aspects of resource management and puzzles in tandem naturally create the third pillar of Resident Evil: tension, which is magnified by one very important feature: there are no checkpoints. You can save only at specific typewriters, and only if you have an Incriban with you. Once again, there are more than enough to last you through an entire playthrough, and most of the time when you get to a new typewriter, you're going to find some Incribans either in the same room or not too far. So you don't have to be extremely diligent about saving. But still, there is always this question of how far are you willing to risk pushing forward without making a save. There is a disadvantage in this approach in that it can potentially make your session time very inflexible. You might be willing to not make a permanent save, but something happening in real life might push you to do that anyway. If the game would have had a one-time autosave on exit that gets deleted once you go back, so not a checkpoint you would return to after death, it would have been far better while retaining the concept intact. But hey, we're talking about a PS1 game from 1996, and we have to take into account that such accessibility aspects weren't usually considered at the time. This whole saving system might feel threatening at first. For a good reason, after all, its entire purpose is to heighten the tension created by the previous facets. But its existence is imperative to showcase the last pillar of Resident Evil: knowledge. Because without checkpoints, sooner or later, particularly on your first playthrough, you will die and get back to your last save point. And that's when the magic happens. Now that you know what to expect, you realize that you can retrace your steps quicker with more efficient pathing and usage of resources. And a lot of challenges in the game are not about skilled play per se, but about knowing what to do. You know that to avoid this one particular zombie, it's best to lean towards one wall and not the other. You know that hunters die from one hit when struck by an acid round. You know that a particular room can be avoided unless you happen to be in a real dire need of healing items. On your very first encounter with 3 zombies in a tight pathway, you might spend a lot of bullets killing them all, but then thanks to your experience, you know how to avoid each and every one of them. And then you learn what key items better to focus on first, and more than that, those actual puzzles you had to spend a little time figuring out, the solutions remain the same, so you can just input them as necessary. And at the end of your playthrough, the game shows how much time it took you to complete it. Since there are 2 playable characters, it's natural to think to yourself, hey, with everything that I know, I can finish the game as this other character much faster. And that's where Resident Evil gets you, subverting your expectations based on knowledge to still create tension. Because Chris and Jill campaigns are not entirely the same. Not only does Jill have 8 inventory slots and Chris 6, they also have different tools, weapons, items and story events, which means that not everything plays out similarly. Jill is more suitable for newcomers, which makes it weird that Chris is the default selection. Regardless, this is not the only way Resident Evil tries to mess with you a bit, but still sooner or later you will get to understand everything there is to the game and use your knowledge to speed up the replay process. And I suppose this is a good opportunity to discuss how you play Resident Evil in the first place. An interesting interaction between the aspects of knowledge and tension is that most of the time, the first decreases the latter. This is why the fixed camera angles of Resident Evil work so well. Now, of course, there is a technical advantage to them. With fixed camera, all environments can be pre-rendered onto a static image, meaning that the game can circumvent technological limitations of contemporary consoles to still create a very detailed picture and have higher quality real-time models, of which there aren't a lot on the screen at any given moment. This looks particularly good on a CRT, since the 2 types of elements blend really well together. With a pretty low resolution, certain key items could be barely noticeable, but that's precisely why Resident Evil makes sure to show them regularly shining. Door opening animations are another smart technical concession. They exist to mask load times between rooms and yet also enhance the feeling of tension, making you wonder what's beyond the next door. There is of course another advantage to using fixed camera angles, limiting a player's view. If you can't see immediately the entirety of this new area you got to after the door opening animation, you have pretty much no knowledge of what's going to happen once you take several steps forward. Therefore, once again, increasing tension. To make your journey through the environments more comfortable, the input direction is based on where the character is facing and not where the camera is looking. Combine that with a lack of strafing, pressing right or left will just turn you around in the respective direction, and you get an input method that's known as tank controls. Now, some might raise an eyebrow when hearing that their purpose is to make gameplay more comfortable, since by their nature tank controls lack precision and therefore are generally undesirable in most games. However, they perfectly fit the fixed camera perspective of Resident Evil. Movement direction relative to the camera has a tendency to break down when the viewpoint instantly shifts every few seconds. There is a method to prevent that from messing up where your character is going, to save the direction of movement between screens as long as you don't change the input. So you might switch perspective while moving to the left, but as long as you keep pushing left, the character will move forward. However, this mechanic requires our brains to readjust what forward means. And when camera shifts are spaced apart considerably, that is absolutely fine. They're not spaced apart in Resident Evil because the game never wants you to see the full extent of the environments. So while it may take some time to get used to the tank controls, ultimately they're more beneficial since you know that forward is where your character's face is, regardless of how often the camera shifts. And yes, the lack of overall precision remains, and sometimes you have to move in a sort of clunky way. But here's the thing, Resident Evil takes that into account with its enemy design. The most common monsters are zombies, and they are lumbering and slow. Another type of enemy you're going to encounter fairly often are undead dogs, and they're fast, but also their attacks are really imprecise, and to avoid them you just have to run forward. In the later parts of the game you're going to meet a lot of hunters, and those are pretty menacing indeed, hence why they can be considered to be difficult. But unless you're playing the original international release of Resident Evil, it's not a problem to actually aim at them. The reason for this kind of specifics is the fact that the original Japanese release has auto-aim, meaning when you pull up a weapon the character automatically turns in the direction of an enemy. That's very useful for the fixed camera paradigm, which can mess with your depth perception. But the first international release for some reason has removed that feature. This is not a concern for all other versions, which we are going to discuss later. And while enemies like hunters can take a lot of bullets from a handgun and even a considerable amount of shells from a shotgun, they can still go down in one hit from an acid round or a magnum. This is why resource management and knowledge are important. I wouldn't call the enemy design in Resident Evil great. Yes, it takes into account the movement systems, but if you take those hunters, they're pretty cheap because when staggered they have a lot of invincibility frames, and their special slash that can kill you in one hit regardless of your health can sometimes be pretty hard to read. Bosses are also not that great. For example, the giant snake Yawn is a relatively nimble bullet sponge that only moves around and tries to bite and poison you, but because of it there is a very real possibility that with its body length it can push you into a corner from which you can't run away. That's not a particularly great boss design by any stretch of imagination. But also it's fine, because if you have properly conserved resources you can take out Yawn very quickly, so this doesn't need to be a particularly elaborate boss. There are some very nice little risk-rewards aspects. If you aim upwards with a shotgun while a zombie is close, it is guaranteed to blow their heads off. But really there is not that much else to discuss when it comes to mechanics of Resident Evil. There is a certain beauty in its simple yet effective approach, but also the lack of quality of life features is felt throughout. For example, you can't manually reload your weapon on the spot, you have to go into your inventory and combine ammo with the weapon. Though that is beneficial from the perspective of all action being paused while you do this. The grenade launcher has several ammo types, so if you're planning to switch to a different one, make sure to utilize everything you've got first, as you can't switch the ammo type unless the grenade launcher is empty. And while there's a number of free buttons on the controller, there's no dedicated map one. To open it, you have to always go through your inventory and select the map. Unless you're playing on a PC, which does have a map button, or DS, where the map is always shown on one of the screens, but until we get to the ports, assume I'm talking about the PS1 version specifically. Another reason to constantly open your inventory is to check your health. Yeah, you'll be opening your inventory a lot. And that screen has some omissions that feel weird, considering Resident Evil does include some nice quality of life features. For example, there are keys that can open multiple doors, and once the game detects that there are no more doors left for the key, it prompts you to discard it. This is very useful since that allows you to not go to safe rooms, which aside from typewriters also have item boxes. Practically unlimited shared storage space. If you put something in one item box, you can take it out from another, a really important aspect of resource management. But you can't combine items in that interface, so if for example you want to take out extra ammo, you need to make sure that you free up a slot, take out what you need from an item box, and then combine them together. There are herbs in the game that you can combine for different healing and poison curing effects, and while if you pick up ammo it automatically gets added to your existing stack, if your inventory is full you can't just combine a herb with one you have already. You also can't just use a herb you're trying to pick up. Each of these issues is pretty small, but they are somewhat annoying considering that their existence doesn't add anything to Resident Evil's resource management focused paradigm. Planning is important, yes, but so is minimizing interface fiddling and still having things make some sort of logical sense, so everyone could truly appreciate the game's really elaborate level design. We have already discussed how Resident Evil is essentially one big puzzle box, but it's not enough to just place a bunch of rooms and randomly fill them with key items and places to use them in and call it a day. There are 3 very important aspects to successful area design in a game like this. Progression, how a space gradually opens up to you. Interconnectivity, how various parts of the space loop into one another, which allows you to plan your route more efficiently. And finally, pacing, how different are things you're doing in various spaces. If we take a look at the mansion, and this example is going to be based on Jill's playthrough, since when you play as Chris there are some key differences but the principle remain overall the same, it might feel like a very large, intimidating space. Which is exactly why at the very beginning, while the story is being set up, you're allowed to explore only the dining room and the adjacent corridor. Out of all the doors available to you, 2 are locked from the other side and 1 requires a lockpick, which you do get after getting back into the main hall. And this is the moment where technically most of the first floor becomes available for exploration. I'm saying technically because there's this significant chunk on the west side that you actually can't get from the first floor still unless you visit the second one first. Which of course you can, but Jill's narrative being for newcomers pushes you to check the east side on the first floor, so most likely on your initial playthrough you'll go there. But while the place might feel complicated because it's so windy, in reality this is actually a straight line with some rooms you can explore on the side. And at the end of this path you will encounter 3 important elements. First, a gate that requires 4 emblems to be unlocked, your new long-term goal. Second, a puzzle that will provide one of the emblems already, setting your mind on that goal. And third, a safe room where after traversing through the dangers of the east side of the mansion, you can finally save your game. From here, the only sensible way to go is up, and there you'll discover just tons of locked doors requiring various special keys. A lockpick is not enough. It's also not a single corridor anymore. Forks are introduced, so you have to start making more choices. And then with nowhere meaningful to progress, boom, you get to the main hall, but on the second floor, completing your first loop. When you go to explore the west side on the second floor, you'll find that there is also not a lot of stuff that you can open, but you can go downstairs into that western part of the first floor you couldn't reach before, and more than that, remember one of the doors locked from the other side? Well, you're on the other side of it now and can unlock it. Boom, another loop. Now you understand the basics of the traversal throughout the space, and the rest is essential about filling in all the blanks by opening up various locations with special keys that you find while solving puzzles. And this is why the mansion is just a wonderfully designed space. Regrettably, the rest of Resident Evil fails a bit when it comes to interconnectivity. The areas are still enjoyable because they succeed in terms of pacing and changing up what you do. After all, if these locations will just be a pathfinding rehash of the mansion, it probably wouldn't really work out. But still, some looping interconnectivity would have been nice. Let's take the guardhouse for example. It houses 2 special enemy types, bosses one can say, although you would be forgiven to not realize the huge shark Neptune is one of them, since the segment with taking it out is so short, you might not even notice it's hunting you in the water. Plant 42 is more elaborate, not only having an actual combat segment, but also a dedicated puzzle to create a special substance that will weaken it if applied to the roots. And this is the guardhouse's biggest weakness when it comes to map design, because you can't make the substance without reading about it first in this room, the key for which is in the basement. And the roots are in the basement. Now, weakening Plant 42 is optional, but if you want to do it, you first have to go get the key for the room leading to the basement, go all the way there, get the key after dealing with Neptune, go all the way back to the room that leads to Plant 42, read about the special substance, make it in a room nearby, then use the same pathway to go all the way back to the basement to pour it on the roots, then all the way back to the room with the book to initiate the boss fight. You might notice there's one very important aspect lacking, and that's looping. Just going back and forth without having to make decisions regarding finding the best route and so on is when backtracking doesn't work. That's pretty boring. The final segment in the lab is only marginally better in this regard, but honestly the lab has several advantages that the guardhouse doesn't. First, if you have been diligent about your resource preservation, you will have enough to just blast through every enemy you see, which feels good. If you get to this point, it won't feel like survival horror, but also that's the nature of this kind of pillar mix. By being considerate in the first parts of the game, you defeat the horror in the later ones. So it's not a problem that environments become more linear in late stages of the game, because if your reward for proper strategizing is stockpiling tons of stuff you can kill with, well, there's not that many interesting choices that can be made in new, larger interconnected environments, since you're just going to destroy everyone in the first place. Second, across various rooms there are special machines that will give out 3 parts of a password, which opens a secret locked door where either Jill or Chris, depending on who you play as, is kept captive. And if you want to get the best ending and save them, you have to open that door. But to get the passwords you need 3 special ammo discs, and those are spread out across different optional parts of the game. And honestly, I feel it's very cool that exploration is rewarded in such a way. Makes it feel that your actions matter. Especially considering that there are other choices I haven't mentioned that are needed for the real best ending where every important character survives. But I suppose we can't really discuss any of the endings without talking about the actual story. The narrative of Resident Evil is constructed out of 3 aspects. The first is world building, and it's fine. The game doesn't really use environmental design to its advantage. In fact, for all its mystery, the mansion overall is quite simplistic and barren. It definitely works from the perspective of clearly seeing and understanding every important gameplay element, but that's not enough for the space to have a personality of its own. Although if there's one thing that mitigates that, it's the ambient music you'll hear every now and then, which feels particularly harrowing, adding to the sense of dread and tension. The music is also one of the reasons why safe rooms are so emotionally effective. Yeah, there's the mechanical implications, but you also can't help but finally feel a sense of relief once you hear a pretty calming melody, although one that is still relatively uneasy because ultimately you haven't escaped the mansion yet. World building is accomplished more through various files you find across the mansion rather than the mansion itself. There's not that many of them, but honestly they're written well enough, providing the necessary context as well as a sense of tragedy to it all. I know the phrase itchy, tasty from one of these files has sort of become a meme, but in the context of reading the journal, it is a bit unsettling to observe how whoever wrote it is gradually losing their sense of humanity due to the outbreak of the T-virus infection. And even though the mansion doesn't really tell any environmental stories on its own, still its design when taken together with the music and the files is effective enough to create a pretty oppressive atmosphere. The second aspect of the narrative is the actual plotline, and it's somewhat simplistic and straightforward, but it's also fine. One thing to note from the get-go is that Jill's story and Chris's one contradict each other, which doesn't really matter when Resident Evil is taken as its own standalone title, which, let's be fair, in 1986 it was. But even with contradicting events, the outline is the same. Contact with one squad of the Special Police Force STARS was lost after it was sent to investigate the area following some weird deaths. Our team was sent to find them and figure out what's going on, only to get separated within a mansion full of zombies, undead rabid dogs, spiders, snakes and whatnot. As we try to escape, we discover that pharmaceutical company Umbrella has a hidden lab where they were developing a biological weapon, the T-virus. However, things went wrong, everything went to shit, and our captain, Albert Wesker, is actually a traitor who doesn't want anything to be uncovered. But come on, how could one trust a person who wears sunglasses at night? We fight a tyrant, a superhuman bioorganic weapon developed with that T-virus, and in the best ending blow up the mansion to smithereens while escaping with the survivors flying towards the horizon. That's it, that's the plot. There are no character arcs to speak of, or interesting personalities in the first place. The protagonists, Jill and Chris, are just dull. The rest of the cast, well, it serves its purpose, that's the best I can say. There is, however, a sort of exception, and that is Barry, who is present only in Jill's campaign. Conceptually, he is actually interesting because on one hand, he helps us out quite a bit, but on another, he's really shifty, so we really are not sure if we can trust him or not. I do have to specify conceptually here, since in practice, that interesting idea has to contend with another aspect of Resident Evil's narrative. It's writing. Do I really need to provide more examples of why it's so bad?
I'm sorry, Jill.
I didn't know that was going to happen.
Sorry. I was really careless.
Are you okay, Barry? Maybe you're getting tired.
No, I'm all right. Don't worry.
The voice acting really doesn't help. There is not a single line that fits. I was surprised to learn at some point that the rookie STARS member Rebecca was widely criticized for seemingly not grasping the gravity of the situation. But come on! Name at least one person in this game who grasps the gravity of the situation. Beyond the acting, there's just the overall weird dialogue implementation in the game, full of pauses which makes the cadence of every conversation feel really unnatural.
Is this?
That's right. This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant! Chris? Stop it.
Wesker, you're pitiful. This is your savior? You say this failure is your savior?
You can make sure yourself whether Tyrant is a failure or not.
There is only one saving grace. This specific combination of writing, acting, and dialogue implementation makes this shit hilarious. And look, being hilarious is actively against the tone the game is clearly going for in absolutely every other aspect. But it's also better than just being so bad it's bad, or even worse, boring, especially considering that with its timer aspect, Resident Evil encourages replayability, and in most versions of the game you can't skip cutscenes. Which leads us to all the various ports. The porting situation with Resident Evil is very interesting. Unless we count the remake, which is clearly just a separate game even though based on the same foundation, every port has a number of differences, some of them really considerable, but also every port provides the same core experience, so you can't say that any of them are actually different titles. There is the original PlayStation version, of course, which has the core campaigns where you play as either Jill or Chris, as well as a couple extras for completing the game. One is a key that allows you to change outfits, and another is a rocket launcher with unlimited ammo if you complete the game in under 3 hours. And I do have to admit that after going through all this effort, it's very satisfying to just instantly kill all the enemies. Later on, PlayStation saw a re-release of the game called Director's Cut. The core gameplay is the same, except the international version turns the auto-aim back on, which really helps. There are new difficulty modes. One is a training difficulty, which provides more resources, and another is an advanced mode where not only the enemies are more dangerous and take more hits to go down, but also pretty much all items have changed their location. It's definitely a challenge, but also a really nice way to experience the game anew once you are familiar enough with the main campaigns. Now, if you ever get the Director's Cut, which is a very good release, make sure to not get the DualShock version, which is not the same. Besides adding DualShock support, it also changes the soundtrack. So if instead of this music, you want to hear this, then sure, be my guest. Admittedly, that is literally the worst example in the entire game, and there are songs in the new version that are actually fine, but I wouldn't say it's worth it in comparison anyway. The PC port is pretty much the same as the PlayStation version, only if I understand correctly, the live-action and pre-rendered cutscenes have their gore uncensored, like in the original Japanese release. Oh, and the frame rate is higher, and you can skip door animations. Also, if you want to get an unlimited rocket launcher besides the timer condition, you also have to make 0 saves. Then there's the Sega Saturn port, which I haven't tried myself, but its alternative outfits are different and there is a special battle mode where you have to kill all enemies in various rooms as fast and efficiently as possible, a precursor to what would become a pretty popular minigame in the franchise's future. The most interesting port is definitely the Deadly Silence version for the Nintendo DS. First, it's the only Western release that has subtitles. It also is the only version where you can skip in-game cutscenes. Now, visually what's interesting is that the pre-rendered backgrounds have lower resolution, probably because the small screen of the DS doesn't require high definition, but the models were actually redone to have more fidelity and higher quality textures. Gameplay-wise, there are additions from some of the later games, like the knife not being a separate item but permanently assigned to the L button. Quick Turn, that became a standard feature of the series later down the line, was also added, as well as the ability to reload weapons without going into inventory. The map and your health status are always seen on the upper screen. With these new gameplay additions, you can go through the classic Resident Evil campaigns. However, there's also a Rebirth mode, which is sort of a middle ground between PlayStation 1's Advanced mode and the classic one. It's a bit more action-focused since there are more enemies out there, but also more ammo. Item placement is mostly the same as in the original experience, however, a bunch of stuff was changed to incorporate, you guessed it, the touchscreen. Some of these additions I don't mind, like replacing the boring push-and puzzle in the armor room with a touchscreen wait puzzle. It makes for a snappier experience. Other changes are quite bothersome. There is a new knife-in minigame which also has an entirely separate bonus mode dedicated to it, and it's fine the first 1 or 2 times you play it, but you will encounter it far more than 1 or 2 times throughout the Rebirth campaign. Some segments have been changed considerably. For example, in the original, when you meet Richard as Jill, you have to run after serum to another part of the mansion. On DS, in the Rebirth mode, you give mouth to mouth, using the microphone.
Richard, what happened?
After blowing Richard, he says what time you need to set the dinner room clock to in order to get some extra ammo. Also, you can sexually harass the main characters. That one is an especially weird feature considering that the port adds new optional outfits and the one for Jill is this. I mean... In addition to all this, I haven't tried it myself, but there's co-op and competitive multiplayer where you go through 10-15 minute scenarios with up to 4 people, though beyond having several DSs you need multiple game copies, so it wouldn't have been easy to try that out even when the port was released. Still, it's a very curious feature. So which version do I consider to be the best? Well, it's difficult to say. I think since each one has the same core campaign, you can't go wrong with any of them. But I have a personal preference for the standard Director's Cut edition on PS1. I think that's where visuals blend in the best, and out of all extra content between different versions, I personally appreciate the advanced mode the most. But extra content is not enough to rate every version differently, so they all are going to get the same Stasocritic rating. Stasocritic is divided into 5 different categories of various weights, each has 11 scores from 0 to 10 with their own criteria. The first category is design with a weight of 4, since how a game is structured and played is what defines the experience the most. I will assign a 7. Resident Evil sets up its pillars and direction exceptionally well, and the mansion is a very good puzzle box. However, the areas around the mansion, while not bad per se, do not reach the same quality. The core gameplay is fine, but could definitely use a significant number of flow improvements. The enemy and boss design is not particularly exciting, and there's really no specific element you can point to and say that this is great on its own. Resident Evil is better than the sum of its parts. The next category is emotions. It has a weight of 3 because personal feelings matter a lot for one's enjoyment. I will assign a 9. While the game does have flaws, there is nothing that can't be circumvented with proper strategizing and resource management. And as such, it is actually really enjoyable to either replay the campaigns for faster time or go through alternative modes in whatever port you're playing, and I thoroughly enjoyed all that. Of course, the first experience doesn't slack either, it's appropriately tense and suspenseful, though for what it's worth I was aware of a lot of things that are going to happen due to experiencing the remake before playing the original, but still. Now we get to cohesion, a category with a weight of 2 that explores how well a game connects all of its different facets together into a singular experience. I will assign a 7. As I said at the very beginning, there is a very clear distinction between Resident Evil the story and Resident Evil the game, so it can't be called a particularly cohesive experience. But also it would be unfair to ignore how the game part connects together the camera, gameplay mechanics, environment design, music, subverting of expectations to create a tense and memorable survival horror experience. And that's probably what helps with assigning the score of 5 to the context category that's all about world building, narrative, characters, and everything that respectively provides context. The story setup is standard, but it works. The characters are not particularly interesting, but also inoffensive. The writing is very bad, but the acting makes it so bad it's funny that it doesn't ruin the experience, and there's enough lore building aspects to sort of balance that out a bit. Finally, we have aesthetics. I will assign an 8. Resident Evil might not excel at everything. The pre-rendered backgrounds do lack some life, the camera angles serve a gameplay purpose but a lot of the time don't provide any particular emotions, and the acting, well, we already discussed that a lot. However, what Resident Evil does is enough to be very atmospheric. Besides, let's not forget that it's a game that was released in the era of CRT TVs and it looks very nice on that technology. After taking every score and their weight into account, Resident Evil will get assigned a final Stasocritic rating of 75. It's a really good game, and no wonder that it became the foundation for a very long-living franchise. Whenever a game as old as Resident Evil is discussed, one that has a remake as successful as it is to boot, there's always a question of relevancy. Is the experience worth it when there's other alternatives? And I'll be honest, even though Resident Evil 1 is a very good game, I would say unless you're a fan of the series or are interested in video game history, there is no real reason to play the original specifically. And it feels weird saying things like that because it is somewhat devaluing of art, but even video games like Resident Evil that can be beaten in several hours take up the most significant resource of a human life: time. Would I be able to say without a shadow of a doubt that Resident Evil is worth your time? No! Only you can do that based on the arguments you have heard in the video.